So I'm very, very grateful to the organizers, Norma, Gillian, your whole team here, and the support. And amazingly, I received a letter of invitation over a year ago, and even in today's slow-working bureaucracy of universities, that made it possible for me to be here, although this is in fact our first week of teaching. I chose, so I feel I'm here sort of as a digestif to help you digest all that we've taken on board this week. We will have to part, but I see this as very much also part of the continuation. To me, it's been extraordinary to come to Colombia for the first time, my fourth South American country, my fifth Latin American country, and then a nice return to the Caribbean after the late 70s when I did some island hopping, Caribbean islands. And it's certainly one of these places you come. It was mythical in 1998. Gillian talked about this extraordinary country, and Barranquilla, Cartagena, Bogota, etc. And now this mythical place has become an extraordinary, wonderful, real one, and one I would love to return to as soon as possible. To return, of course, I will have to leave, and that's true of many of us. Okay? But that's sad, but true. It'll work, yeah. I've been very lucky taking in 3 SFL conferences this summer season. And this one was the international one, held for the first time in Indonesia, in Bandung. And the theme here was education. In the context of this conference, Jim and I talked, and you've seen Jim on Sysfling saying what a fantastic congress it was, but he was also worried about sort of regionalism or regional fragmentation, meaning simply because there are so many events around the place and our increasingly small world is still pretty big, it's difficult for people to get around to all of them. So there's very little overlap between the Indonesian event and this event, for example. There are a few of us, like Orlando and myself are both here. Stella was also in Indonesia. But it is a fact of time, of cost, of money we can squeeze out of university travel and so on. So I think, thinking about a new society, we are moving to a period where increasingly we can think about how can new technologies help us sort of overcome the geographic distance and so on. Some of you remember from the ISOC in 2010 in Vancouver, organized by Jeff Williams. Jeff made a very valiant attempt to have one session where the whole world was participating, meaning we were all there in different time zones trying to discuss things. It was an interesting experiment, and that's how we move forward. I don't think it's been tried again in the context of such a conference. The problems were, of course, that people were in very different time zones. The technology is better now 6 years later, but there were certainly participants from Latin America in this. And I think it's something to keep on the agenda, see what we can do in terms of developments. At the European International one in Salzburg, we also had to come to the sad moment of parting, but the very last session included an invitation to the University of Salamanca less than a year from now. So the 29th of June to the 1st of July, the European International one will be held at the University of Salamanca for the first time. And so with luck, we can meet again, a number of us at the University of Salamanca. It's of course a very old university, and the people who presented this emphasized that the conception of that conference will be crossroads. Okay, so we have a new society now, and in years' time we'll be crossroads. I mention it partly because, at least if you're in Colombia, it's relatively easy to get to Spain. I know, because I flew from Madrid to Bogota using Avianca. I'd recommend that route. Okay. So, wishful thinking is always good. See you in Salamanca in 2017. But now, we still have this Congress to enjoy, right? Even though we've come to the end, so we there with some reorganization, there is a tremendous achievement. And yesterday, Teresa really illuminated the theme in a way that I would skirt around, meaning what can we do in terms of meanings for a new society? And so central to this, as was brought out wonderfully in Teresa's plenary, is education. And Mary, at the very beginning of the conference, Mary Schleppegrell on Wednesday said, the future are the, our new family members, the family members to come to us in kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, tertiary school, and so on. So we're lucky enough, always in that sense, to be involved in the future, with the future. Okay? But that's important to remember, and the project that Teresa talked about, which is sort of turning history into something that is also a guide to the future, is incredibly important. I touched on this because of the sort of tendency to forget. Now, if we're thinking about a new society, of course, one could take a deep time or big history perspective, or macro history. So people talk about cosmogenesis, so the evolution, the development of the cosmos. And so the new society, we can locate, we know we're some distance from the Big Bang. We're right there at the cutting edge. So that's where our new society is, or in fact, renewing society. Because hopefully our society is stable, reasonably, but is stable in the particular sense that J. Lemke, who's been referred to during this conference, brought to our attention many years ago. It's stable in the sense of being metastable. So our new society is stable because it's always changing, so it's metastable. It receives its stability by constantly changing according to the conditions in which it is evolving. And one very interesting macro history project was initiated by David Christian. He simply calls it Big History, and is really for history as a school subject. And lots of information available on the web. One can just sign up and use these resources. So Big History, and it goes back to prehistory and beyond prehistory. But again, we can locate ourselves here, and we can think about what are the how can we come to understand the evolution of meaning for the sort of renewing society that we're involved in. I won't talk so much about the evolution of meaning. I put that a little bit in the abstract, but more a little bit about the implications for the study of meaning as we approach the new society or new societies. Okay? Human evolution, of course, 5 million years ago, these were our ancestors. Today, this is one of our brothers. Okay. And some wit said, human evolution, there is a missing link. Okay. So important for us is to think about trends. And there are so many trends that people suggest. Let me mention some that I think are very, very general. So for example, in human history, shift from biological evolution to social and semiotic evolution. Meaning for a lot of our history, we evolved certainly, and focus in the study of this is on the biological evolution until we became AMHs, so anatomically modern humans, around 150 to 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapiens. Okay? So evolution was relatively slow. There was, of course, social evolution, semiotic evolution, but in a sense we weren't biologically ready yet for social and semiotic evolution to take over. People call this cultural evolution, social learning, whatever it is. But this was the beginning of a tremendous acceleration. And part of the challenge when we study meanings for a new society is we are accelerating, we're constantly accelerating, so the complexity is increasing all the time, and this increase is exponential. So that's part of the huge challenge in studying meanings for a new society. So accelerated increase in complexity, and this is enabled by higher order evolution, meaning that evolution is now, in a sense, primarily social and semiotic. Semiotic meaning evolution of meanings. Okay? Now, people talk about this in different terms. So, for example, people talked about, say, this, we're now in the fourth industrial revolution. So from the beginning of the industrial revolution that depended on machines like the steam engine to the information age, knowledge society, knowledge industry, meaning this is the manifestation of the industrial revolution that is based on meaning. So again, meanings for a new society. And things that seem counterintuitive. One trend is decrease in violence and in poverty. Return to violence, if I make it time-wise. So I put an exclamation mark because that's not the sense what one expects. But indeed, this is well documented. But this is also, and this is important for us in terms of thinking about meanings, there's maybe a shift from have-nots to know-nots or do not know, a point Michael Halliday's made, meaning we're used to thinking about the world divided by people who have and haven't got, but increasingly is a world of people who know and people who don't know. Okay? And globalization is, of course, something very well known. People argue about how long it's been going on, but it's been going on for a very long time. But again, incredible exponential acceleration, right? And then people discuss, sort of say, well, you can't just think of this in terms of linear time, but also cyclical time. Okay? And then there are material changes, so sort of seasonal cycle to human history. And then material changes like deforestation, loss of biological diversity, semiotic diversity, global warming, and so on. And if one looks around for books that treat this kind of what you might say cluster of things around a new society, you have titles like The Fourth Industrial Revolution up there, and if you scoot down to the south eastern corner, The Fourth Turning. So there's something about fourth, right? So the Fourth Industrial Revolution, that meaning the face of the Industrial Revolution, we now at a sort of essentially meaning-based Industrial Revolution. The Fourth Turning, that's sort of a notion that we go through cycles. And when this book appeared in the late 1990s, the authors predicted we're moving into the fourth season of this cyclical movement. Okay? And then big histories become very much part of the picture in the way it wasn't a couple of decades ago. So big history, this is David Christian and others. A very recent book by a very interesting Israeli historian, Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Okay? It's brief, it ends on page 450 or so. Okay? And the singularity is near. Should we worry or not? Okay? And connectography, right? So the increasingly connected world in the globalized world and so on. Okay? And all these actually have implications for meanings in a new society. And you also find books that deal with the sort of information age, the technology and so on, but in terms that are more immediately in our backyard, like this book, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in the Digital Age. And one thesis then is traditional face-to-face conversation is sort of disappearing and being displaced by texting and all the rest. Now, before this book appeared, here's something by Michael Halliday talking about sort of bite-size tendency, trend. So he says, even within one language, we can see new patterns in the integration of the metafunctions. Okay? Metafunctions with meanings now often packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks. You think text messages, WhatsApp, whatever it might, Skype and so on, right? Or chirping, or tweeting, okay? To accommodate the reduced space on small screen and the reduced time scale of much of today's interaction, attention span of the interactants. Here, both interpersonal and textual meanings take on a new prominence, though for different reasons. the textual in integrating the various semiotic strands, with interesting consequences that it becomes less explicit in the text, rather like the subtitles in a foreign language movie. So translation scholars like Alaini Espindola should be happy, right? The interpersonal, on the other hand, becoming more explicit as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized. We're never shown parliamentary debates on our television screens, only ranting and swapping of abuses that are thought of to make good television. Okay? And then he comments and he says, you will notice that he doesn't like this, and he associates this kind of development that actually very little studied, right? There are lots of studies of internet language or text messaging and so on, but he says this is part of what seems to be a destruction of knowledge, okay? And he says that, or rather than destruction, maybe polarization, and this is where he comes in and talking about the knows and the know-nots and the don't knows, right? And he sort of suggests that it may be good reason to study this very carefully in terms of what's happening to meanings or knowledge, okay, taking these to be just different ways of looking at it. And this is in a grand sweep through kind of what we call semi-history, where he tracks developments from the forest, so that's pre-agriculture, through the farm to the factory. And then he's trying to come up with a term for our current age or period, and he suggests fantasy as one possibility. Partly, of course, he wants 4 Fs, but fantasy, the sort of Disney-fied world, may not be too bad. So trends. Let me say a little bit about knowledge creation and representation. And starting with something that has surely been around for a very, very long time, since the beginning of the sort of construction of knowledge in semiotic social terms. So common sense of folk knowledge, okay? And let me again quote from Michael Halliday in this article on Language Evolving. And he says, one genre that has played an important part in the evolution of knowledge is narrative, in which preserved accounts of past or imaginary events are rehearsed in more a stylized and ritualized form, events which encapsulate the accumulated experience of the community. Such narratives are instantial. They have particular protagonists who have proper names, along with their own particular doings. So instantial in terms of generalizations by classes. Okay? And at ISSC in Indonesia, Jim Martin gave a talk on telling stories, which further illuminated this. Okay? So let me just very quickly give you a snapshot of a well-known example. And I'm just using here a retelling for children of one of the stories from Genesis, Noah's Ark. Okay? And on certain days, this has seemed very appropriate in Barranquilla, when the floodgates opened and rain just poured down. So I'm wondering if there is an ark that is listo, that is ready for action somewhere in Barranquilla. Now, so this is a cover retelling for children. This is the very beginning, so typical picture book, and through the work of Jeff Williams, Glenn Unsworth, Claire Painter, Jim Martin, and many others, we now have more of a sense of the kinds of meanings that are created through picture books for children. And that is, of course, part of what Cressum and Liven have observed, that more and more of images come into different kinds of registers, genres, even before the technologically enabled multimodality. Okay? So this is, as I said, a retelling for children. So it says, once, a very long time ago, there lived a man called Noah. He and his wife and his sons and their wives all worked very hard. Now, Noah was a good man. You can do an appraisal analysis as you go through, right? And this pleased God. Okay? But all around him, Noah's neighbors were lying and fighting and cheating and stealing. We all know what neighbors are like, right? This made God sad. Okay? One day God spoke to Noah. I'm going to send a great flood to wash the world away, he said. But I will save you because you're good. Okay? And so it goes, familiar. Now, notice here, God speak to Noah. Okay. So what I want to do to illustrate very, very briefly is a sort of construction of knowledge, instantial knowledge, in a sense subliminally through this. Okay, so if you do a transitivity analysis, and I've done this, you can sort of see what are the patterns that emerge in terms of who acts or senses or whatever in what participant role with respect to some other person. And this is related to Rekha Hassan's work on the and the E roles in the participants. Okay? So a bit later, having been instructed, Noah tells his family, and then he and his sons go out, and you can see what's happening here, right? The very next morning, Noah and his sons went to the cypress forest to cut down the tallest trees for timber. For many days, they're sawed and chopped. Okay, so represented both linguistically, pictorially, and again, just a representative example of what the transitivity analysis brings out. Now, not in a verbal clause, but a material clause. Noah and sons as actor in the process of cutting down, as a destructive process, and then the tallest trees as goal. Okay, so this develops through the whole text. Now, one of the things that's done is, of course, is what Rekha Hassan called a theme. It, as it were, builds up, step by step, clause by clause, a kind of cosmology. Okay? And we could have a stab at interpreting this cosmology as it is developed, constructed clause by clause. So we could say context in terms of the field, Old Testament cosmology, and key components here: God is creator, destroyer of cosmos. So it's geocentric and also, not surprisingly, patriarchal. So how is this then created linguistically? Well, in the semantics, right, which is what we're getting towards, there is, among other things, a hierarchy of potency. Okay? So the potency in the sense of who can, as it were, control whom in different kinds of processes. And this hierarchy of potency is built up clause by clause. So God controls natural forces. They control the rest of creation, meaning they can destroy them. Humans, and within humans, men, and within men, patriarch and controlling sons. And then you have the women, and then you have the rest of creation, non-humans. Okay? And so this turns up in different process types, but certainly in material clauses. Okay? So this would be a little small to do, but what I've done here is vertically set up this sort of hierarchy of potency or control, and then look at what kind of entities serve in the different participant roles. Okay, so this is what you get through the transitivity analysis, getting at the hierarchy of potency. Okay, so at the top then, God can act in material processes like sending, floods, rainbows, saving, washing away the world, destroying the world, saving Noah and his family because they're good. Noah then, and he can speak to them and so on, Noah then can speak to his family, and so on and so forth. And the activities come through very clearly that Noah and his sons do different things from his wife and their sons. So this is something we can explore, and Jeff Williams has demonstrated how, given the kind of reflection literacy that Mary Schleppergel talked about on day one, children can actually begin to look at this in an informed way, critical, and so see alternatives, right? Now, if it's raining, you have to be careful not to miss the boat. Okay. Okay, so remember that when the rain sets in. Okay. Now I'll skip this, but there is an interesting commentary by the talk show host and stand-up comedian Bill Maher on this. But in the interest of time, I will skip this. Now, so a lot of folk common sense knowledge got constructed in this way, and what you have here is, of course, a combination of field, the ideational, this is the world is, with tenor, the interpersonal, a value system. So they work together. They are very powerful because precisely because they're subliminal. So it doesn't say anywhere, this is the way the world is. You could argue with it, no, because step by step it's built up in this subliminal or implicit way. Okay? And so one could contrast the folk common sense models of the world with scientific ones, and various interesting things. This is from a sort of book by article by anthropologist. But one aspect of this is that folk views tend to be fairly holistic and intuitive, whereas scientific ones tend to be sort of componential, reductionist, analytical. Okay? And that's interesting to think about when we grapple with the task of studying meanings for a new society. If you think about 20th century linguistics, it has been like Western science in general. It has tended to be componential, fragment. You do things by fragments, and is precisely what Descartes advocated in his meditations. So if you go to his meditations, he essentially says you deal with the complexity of studying things by sort of moving into ever smaller fragments. Okay? And then we get a fragment that's small enough manageable enough to study, then you begin your analysis. Okay? So that's very different from the ecological approach, and it's very different from the contextual approach Malinowski advocated around the same time as the 1920s. And that is, of course, what fed into one strand of linguistics in the 20th century, systemic functional linguistics. But if you look at most other traditions, and certainly the US-American tradition, that's much more like the characterization of Western science, so componential analysis, Cartesian methods, Cartesian analysis. What about knowledge itself? If we just take a few minutes to sort of think about how knowledge has been itself, how that has been conceptualized through history. Well, one could go back to ancient Greek, and it's very interesting to say, for example, look at Tacitus and how knowledge is constructed there, dialogically. Not too complex, and here they're concerned is, knowledge and wisdom, are they one and the same or not, using Socratic method. But let me skip forward to the 17th century, sort of the beginning of changes leading to modern science. And here is John Locke in his essay concerning human understanding. Okay? So it's just a sample of lots of things one could look at. And sort of just interested in how does he talk about knowledge. So a little passage, he says, "This therefore being my purpose, to inquire into the original certainty and extent of human knowledge, together with the grounds and degrees of belief, opinion, and assent. I shall not at present meddle with the physical considerations of the mind, or trouble myself to examine wherein its essence consists, or by what motions of our spirit or alterations of our bodies we come to have any sensation by our organs, or any ideas in our understandings, and whether those ideas do in their formation, any or all of them, depend on matter or not." Okay? So of course this is very far from where we're at now. But what's interesting is precisely his construal of knowledge. You see, it goes together with belief, opinion, assent, ideas, understanding, sensations, and so on. And also this concern with certainty, original knowledge. And if you go through all of his essay, which is of course pretty long, what's the most common premonifier of knowledge, now looking just at the normal group, is intuitive. Okay? So the second rank is certain, then real, then general, then true. Okay? So there's a lot of concern at the time of sort of the veracity of knowledge. Okay? And I think that's interesting. And human versus universal, rational, sensitive, undoubted, moral, and so on. Okay? But knowledge is here the thing in itself, and the sort of modification has to do with its sort of epistemological status. Okay? And if one does a kind of word cloud for his human understanding, you see ideas are very prominent, mind, and so on. But you also have knowledge being fairly prominent. Okay? Has this changed? Has been a trend in the sort of change in the understanding of knowledge and the treatment of knowledge itself? Well, let me jump forward to the late 20th century, early 21st century. And of course, there are lots of publications, documents, and so on, where there are discussions of knowledge. But here is a representative sample that sort of illustrates something about the change in the treatment or conception or construction of knowledge in discourse. Okay? So this is from a scholar, Leidersdorf, and the title is Indicators for Measurement of the Knowledge Base. Okay? Notice here knowledge is no longer thing head, but it is itself a modifier. Okay? And in the abstract of this article it says, the knowledge infrastructure of an economy can be viewed in terms of the networked relations among universities, industries, and governmental agencies. While both links and the nodes of the network can be measured by using various indicators, for example, patterns, hyperlinks, citations, the knowledge base can be considered as a result of the interactive fluxes of communication through these networks. Okay? So fairly different flavor to the discourse here. And then continues to say knowledge-based innovations. So here a modifier of the modifier, okay? Knowledge infrastructure of knowledge-based systems of innovations, okay? That's us, folks, okay? Partly, okay? Organized knowledge. So it's a different kind of framing of knowledge, okay? So for example, if you continue in this article, you also get things like knowledge flows both within organization and across institutional boundaries, okay? So you see there is a move here to treating knowledge as a kind of commodity, a commodity that can modify bases and infrastructures and so on, and that can flow. Okay? And you get things, if you look into the literature, you get things like models for, in this case, a model for knowledge, competence, and management. Okay? And notice what the thing is, the head is management. Okay? That's uncomfortably sort of real to us in universities, isn't it? Okay? Not knowledge itself, but as a management of knowledge and the management of knowledge workers, us. And Bernstein, of course, Basil Bernstein picked up on this. So in one chapter in his book from '96, and then appeared in revised version a few years later, Thoughts on the Trivium and Quadrivium, The Divorce of Knowledge from the Knower. It's a very interesting title. And again, something that's absolutely central to sort of our conception of meanings in a new society. So he says, of fundamental significance, there is a new concept of knowledge and its relation to those who create and use it, okay, etc. Knowledge should flow like money. So notice the same kind of metaphor here, knowledge flowing, right? Indeed, knowledge is not like money, it is money, okay? So that should be good for us, shouldn't it? Okay. Knowledge is divorced from persons, their commitments, their personal dedications, and so on. Okay? So that is also important to keep in mind for us. The flow of knowledge, moving knowledge about, and so on. And so if one tried to schematize this, there is a sort of sense from knowledge and as a process, she knows that, and so on. This would be common sense view, right? Then into the nominal group, John Locke, mid-17th century, certain knowledge, moral knowledge, and so on. And then now to where we are at today, knowledge economy, knowledge society, knowledge workers, knowledge management, and so on, knowledge infrastructure, and so on. So from knowledge as knowing a personalized process to knowledge as a commodity, detached, as Bernstein says, from the knower. Okay? And if you put this in linguistic terms, what's implicated is, of course, the mental clause, right? Somebody knows something, and how this then is metaphorized as knowledge, and knowledge then can take on participant roles in material clauses. It can flow, for example. It can be a pre-modifier in nominal groups, and of course it can also be occur in relational clauses. So this is a very much part of the trends today. Now, this suggests that it's all linear. Okay, so we're just moving, and in some sense this is true. But one of the interesting things when we're looking at trends in development, coming to terms with this in the study of meanings, is also the emphasis by various scholars on cycles in history, on cyclical patterns. Okay? And this is where the book The Fourth Turning comes in. A very interesting discussion of conceptions of time, sort of from pre-agricultural day where they said people had a sort of chaotic model of time, and agriculture that was a cyclical model of time, the seasons, the cycle of the day and so on. And then maybe starting 500 years ago or so, a very linear model of time. Sort of we fool into thinking there's constant progress we're always building on. But they argue, the authors here, that we need also to take into account cyclical time. And this, of course, not a new idea. And in one of his major studies in the 21st century, Halliday, on matter and meaning, talks about cycles in history. And he says, this chapter, so this appeared in the first issue of the journal, what is it called? Linguistics and Human Sciences, I think, LHS, one of Jonathan Webster's efforts, right? This chapter is about the nature of happenings, more particularly the happenings that constitute the human experience. What happens becomes history. Someone who studies and tells what happens is a historian. And then I've left out a bit, and it says, as a student many years ago, my encounter with history was the history of China. And since I'm writing this in Hong Kong, right, where Chinese and English history met, let me draw examples of happenings and tellings about happenings from these two sources. The motif is familiar, okay, is a familiar one. It is that of cycles, cyclical patterns in the order of historical events. Chinese history has traditionally been interpreted in terms of cycles, as each new dynasty first flourished, then matured, and then declined, only to be overthrown by a successor, which then went through the same sequence of events. A typical cycle lasted 250 to 300 years. Okay? And then he draws a parallel with England, and also cycles, and he says, in the past 1,000 years, this cycle has continued, but the invasions have taken a different form. So he talked about England being invaded in sort of cyclical patterns. Not physical force, but intellectual and political pressure. So again, that's interesting in terms of meanings in sort of cyclical patterns in new societies. Okay? And then he talks about a Eurocycle. Now this was 11 years ago. Now he could, of course, add a little footnote to this Eurocycle, the tragic Brexit. Okay? So this part of these cycles. And it's also so these are longer cycles, but there are cycles within cycles. And one thing I think that's intriguing and important for us, and this goes right back to Teresa's talk and insights, is what are the sort of generational memories in shorter cycles. Now, the authors of the fourth turn suggest that it is sort of traditionally, in traditional society, it is a seculum, roughly a long human life, so 80 to 100 years. Okay? But when we think about major events like wars and conflicts, what are the cycles, and what are the cycles of wars wars and protests against wars? And just as an example, so in the early 80s, the group of singers that became well known in the 60s, Peter, Paul and Mary, performed a song called El Salvador. And it starts out sounding like a tourist brochure. So they say, there's a sunny little country south of Mexico where the winds are gentle and waters flow, but breezes aren't the only thing that blow in El Salvador. And that's sort of the beginning of the turn. Okay? Now, that's interesting to look at in terms of the wordings, the meanings, and also the music. Now, that's actually a protest, and what it says is to the US, get out of El Salvador. Don't mess people's lives up. Now, that's 83. 20 years later, what were the leaders about to do? Well, they're about to return to this kind of thing. 83 is about 20 years after the beginning of moving into Vietnam on a big scale, right? 20 years after 83, what's that? Well, that's, of course, the second Gulf War, the Allied attack on Iraq. And here a distant relative of mine, before it happened, but it was unstoppable, Peter Matthiessen, wrote also a protest, not in the form of a song, but in forms of a sort of opinion piece, lighting the fuse, freeing the Iraqi people to death. Okay? And he said, well, this is what the so-called freeing of the Iraqi people will lead to. And sadly, he was absolutely right. Now, the interesting thing for meanings in a new society in these cycles is what can we do? How can we understand these? How can we come to understand them? But what's possible to do through educational processes, for example, to make sure that memories are not lost, or rather that it's not possible to fool people into thinking that war is a solution ever again, not at 20-year intervals. So what's so important then is tracking trends. And this is, I think, a big challenge to us. Of course, we're very good as systemic functional linguists. We're very good at quite detailed and high-level, informed, insightful manual analysis. Okay? So very good at taking text in context, analyzing it exhaustively, not pecking at the text, not take just little samples, but actually a full range of systems, if necessary, and building up the analysis from there. But what the pressures call for in sort of meanings for a new society is precisely this, what I've hinted at, is dealing with large volumes of text. Now, to illustrate the changing in the framing of knowledge, I did a bit of sampling, and this was, of course, I used some computational tools to discover what John Locke, for example, how he constructed knowledge. But this is, even though his essay is long, it's not that big, but we're dealing with volumes of text. And we're in a sort of semiotic period of tremendous change comparable to the printing, what the printing press led to. So sort of like the introduction of printing, there was an explosion of text, of course, and many more readers, much more dissemination. But similar, this has happened now. And so we need, in a sense, new ways of studying these meanings so that we can understand them, but also act on, intervene based on this understanding. And one can look around, and people outside linguistics, certainly outside systemic functional linguistics, are doing things. One fairly early example is theme river, okay? And there's a little gloss on it. It says, the theme river visualization helps users identify time-related patterns, trends, and relationships across a large collection of documents, okay? The themes in the collection are represented by a river that flows left to right through time. The river widens or narrows to depict changes in the collective strength of selected themes in the underlying documents. Individual themes are represented as color currents in the river, right, flowing within the river. The theme currents narrow or widen to engage changes in the individual theme strength at any point in time. So essentially, this is a brute force lexical analysis, right? So that's what you can achieve analytically. What does this look like? Well, here is an illustration of their work from motifs in Fidel Castro's speeches in 1961. Okay? I can magnify it a little bit, but what I'd like you to sort of just see is the sort of whenever the currents widen, that means higher frequency of certain themes, and these are, of course, Lexis-based. And then they correlate, so you have things like oil, reform, Yankee, Soviet, weapons, imperialists. Yes, right. That's Europeans like myself, right? Operatives and so on. So you see, they widen and go narrow, and then they correlated this with events. That's the kind of thing. If we could have tools like this, but then also back it up and not just make it a sort of study of words, but actually patterns of meaning, that would be a very important development for us. So I think that's part of what we need to focus. We need to, draw in students from departments of computer science and so on, teach them linguistics, and then see them prosper in developing this. A much more recent movement has been called culturomics, and that's again people outside linguistics looking at masses of text, and their vision is to be able to analyze culture using millions of digitized books. Okay? Again, it has to be Lexis-based, so again, it's from below in terms of Halliday's trinocular vision. So it's from below, so it's wordings, lexical wordings, rather than meanings, rather than patterns of meanings. How can we come in, how can we work with technologies like this to actually get at changes in meanings and get a more much more solid interpretation, informed interpretation. Now, one area obviously one can look at on these terms is media, sort of flow of media discourse. And here's Halliday again. This is his paper on new ways of meaning. He says, our culture is becoming trapped inside a kind of semiotic cycle. So this is another kind of cycle. Inside a semiotic cycle in which the environment that is depicted by the media is also one that is created by the media. Okay? So the environment that the media reports on is one that they themselves create. Okay? And this is, again, a tremendous challenge, danger, so opportunity for semioticians in thinking about the study of meanings in the move towards new versions of society. Okay? And this, I think, you all know, he goes on to say, what sorts of doings are typically transformed into news on television, radio, and in mass circulation print? So remember, this is a bit over 20 years ago now, so before the World Wide Web had taken over, at least become one of the main sources of distribution of media, right? The so-called new media. There seem to be two dominant motifs. One is discourse and the other is death. Okay? So these are motifs he picks up in the news. Grammatically, most constituents of news texts are either projections, okay, so we have verbal clauses and so on, right? What somebody said, for example, I will not stand down, said a defiant Mr. Greiner, or else material processes of the destruction category. For example, 14 people were killed when a gunman opened fire in a Texas supermarket. Still very familiar, right? Very often, one of these motifs is introduced as a subplot of the other. Killers threaten further reprisals. The third motif, a little behind these two, is that of money, discourse, death, and dollars, if you want to complete a 3D trilogy. So then he goes on to characterize this. Now again, that's interesting. Is this something we can study? And the tools are available to us, but with the usual user warning. Meaning, as soon as you examine large volumes of text, you may very likely to pick up different senses of lexical items, so you have to go in and examine them. So it's a kind of crude first outline. But let's just sort of look at a cluster of things just to cheer us up. Death, okay? Lexical items relating to potential death, destruction, and disaster, okay? And you can use different tools through the web resources at Brigham Young University. They made available about 80 years of Time magazine. Okay, and if you track this from the 1920s to the noughts, so 1920s are left to the noughts, you see peaks in the frequency just of the lexical item military. Okay, not surprisingly, one is sort of starts late 30s, and another one is in the 1980s. Okay, and you can also track more positive things like liberation movement or terrorism, terrorists. Okay, and you see they vary over time. Okay, one can also do this with books that have been digitized by Google, Ngram Viewer. So here's an engram, and military, if you use the books, there are peaks and troughs, but it's constantly there in the discourse presented by the books. And then terrorism and so on, also there, it seemed to increase, but let me take out the military, wishful thinking, right? And so that will lead us terrorism and terrorists, so terror and so on. So you see, there is in these books, digitized books, there's a marked increase really since the late 90s. So a very marked increase in terrorism and terrorists. Okay, let me magnify this a little bit further for you. Okay, so you see since the late 90s, terrorism, and then also you get some other things, jihad, for example, jihadist. Liberation movement is declining. Okay, and if you look at combinations, and I'm now going back to Time magazine, terror attacks, of all the things where terror is a pre-modifier, attacks is by far the most frequent. So towards our period, then suddenly terror attacks build up. So one of the things when we explore meanings for a new society is this Michael Halliday's semiotic cycle. So meaning, how do we sort out what is constructed by the media and what actually happens in the material world? And this is very difficult, of course, and various analysts contribute significantly to this. The question I'm raising is, or suggestion I'm making is, really, if we go beyond these crude things and we are able to marry them in a sense, or work together with the very sophisticated kind of analysis we can do in SFL, maybe we can get a handle on this. So maybe we can get a perspective on it. Now, if these of course things, these raise anxiety, they contribute to fear, and we know that there are various politicians who sort of really flourish when there is fear around. It's used in election campaigns and so on. Now, one could have as a counterpoint, what are the material trends over a longer period of time? And here is one macro historian, I mentioned him before, Harari, so Yuval Noah Harari, in his brief history of humankind. And he says, most people don't appreciate just how peaceful an era we live in. Okay, that does seem a bit counterintuitive. None of us was alive 1,000 years ago, so we easily forget how much more violent the world used to be. Okay, and then he goes on. I won't read all of it, but the general point is he discusses this, and one can go to it and see explore his evidences. But he says the decline of violence is due largely to the rise of the state. Throughout history, most violence resulted from local feuds between families and communities. And even today, as the above figure indicates, local crime is far deadlier threat than international wars. Okay? And then he goes on to discuss this. One can go to different sources that give information, and some of it is, of course, guesswork, projected. This is one figure that goes back to 1400 up to 2000, and the red line essentially indicates deaths in conflicts, wars, and so on. And the big blobs, major disasters, like the Second World War, First World War, Afghan War, and so on. Okay, but if you magnify this and we move towards the present, you see there is a clear trend downwards. So I'm just going further. Okay, so there is a clear trend downwards. Even though, if you just rely on the news, you have the sense that it's becoming increasingly violent, and we should be more and more scared about these terrorist attacks and so on. I'm not saying to ignore that, but just sort of say, can we put it in perspective? And here's another source of sort of information about sources of death. Okay, so what are categories of death? Children under age 5, all causes. So it includes poverty, malnutrition, and so on. Very, very high. Tobacco, very, very high. Child under malnutrition, also that's a separate category, very, very high. Overweight and obesity, very, very high. Where does terrorism come in? There. Okay? So it's just a little counterbalance. Should we be more worried about terrorism or McDonald's? Fast food, junk food. So in terms of overall trends, okay? But of course it's will suit certain people to get as worried about terrorism. And I'm not saying it's not awful, it is, but just on balance. One could do the same for discourse. Remember, Michael Halliday talked about death, discourse, and dollars. Just very briefly on discourse, because it's something that has been a motif in ASFAL conferences. Come up again this week very strongly, work on within the SAL group on verbal clauses, on projection, and so on. So let me say a little bit, very, very briefly, about verbs potentially serving and projecting verbal clauses. And again, turn to Time magazine. So 1920s to into the noughts, okay? And you could look overall and you say, it's interesting, there's some things that seem a bit hard to explain. Surely everywhere forms of say are the most common verbs in verbal clauses. That's certainly true. Any form of tell, much less common, even though tell is also very common. Intriguingly, in Time magazine, said is on its way down, says is on its way up. That seems strange, doesn't it? I hope you think so that when I offer an explanation, you'll be intrigued. Well, I've noted, but this needs careful examination, that increasingly in Time magazine, you get these, as it were, preposed verbal clauses. You've made some generalization as a journalist, and then you provide the attribution, the evidence. So you've said this and this, says President Obama. Okay, and that's their way of indicating that here is attribution, here is evidence for the generalization made in the journalist's voice. But then you could also, again, we won't pursue this, but you could also look at more loaded verbs of saying. And if you were in Jesus' talk earlier today, he talked about this in terms of academic discourse, right? And it's very, very interesting in academic discourse, how do the sort of loaded meaning either positive or negative as opposed to neutral verbs, and he looked at the whole environment. Well, in journalistic discourse, again, Time magazine, you can see these more loaded ones like claimed, argued, claims, claimed, argues. They're not all level, they peak at certain points. So if you take claimed in the 1940s, argued in the 1960s, claims then come in the 1970s, claimed again in the 1980s, and argues in the 1960s. Now, these are just samples, but the interesting question is, in this discourse, can we actually find trends in the construction of news or the perception of what was going on in the world in this way? So again, I leave that for consideration for potential future projects and so on. And let me conclude. Am I on time, roughly? Okay, thank you. So, by way of conclusion, just a few more points. So, study of meaning in sort of evolving society, in new society evolving. So, one of the things I suggested is tools and techniques. So, a big challenge for us now, a rapidly increasing one, is the masses of volumes of text that need to be analyzed automatically if we anyway going to get a handle on it. And how do we marry that sort of complementary technique that we're used to as discourse analysts, small samples analyzed manually? So some of you will remember Michael Hoey at the Liverpool ISOC in 2002, and he gave a talk saying he started out as a discourse analyst, then he became totally infatuated with the corpus, and after the love affair with the corpus, he remembered he was a discourse analyst, right? So good, he went back to his first love, but he kept his second love. So he was looking for ways of sort of linking manual discourse analysis to large-scale automated corpus analysis, and that led him to sort of examination, for example, of paragraph beginnings and endings and so on. And parallel things were going on in systemic functional linguistics. I mean, I take him as a fellow traveler originally from Birmingham. So I think that's very important. That's a real methodological challenge for studying meanings in our new societies. And the role of meaning. So as I said at the beginning, now meaning itself has become a central resource and a commodity. And that's reflected in all these ways of talking about information age, knowledge society, knowledge management, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, that simply means that in terms of central commodities, we moved away from goods and services. I mean, not discarding them, but meaning has come in. So information, knowledge, whatever you call it, as very central. And so we need to draw on the sort of techniques that create these meanings to turn them back on meaning itself and study them in large patterns. And then very importantly mentioned, but not emphasized here, increased networking on meaning and now technologically enabled. And David Christian says in his big history book, when in a chapter where he begins to talk about language, he says the common mistake many colleagues in sort of more cognitive sciences or even anthropologists will make is to compare one chimpanzee brain with one human brain. And he says the mistake is we should compare one chimpanzee brain with hundreds of human brains. Why? He says language. Because language made possible, and that's the beginning of the explosive development of human evolution, language makes possible a collective brain. So we have lots of fellow travelers, lots of family members from other species. We should work with in very positive ways, but none have sort of transcended this to create a truly collective brain, which includes then learning across generations, social learning, whatever you call it. So if you think about what we're talking about, knowledge, so experience construed as meaning, okay? This is then a property of meaning groups consisting of meaners, so meaning potential trustees. So we are all trustees of some meaning potential or other, or Spanish, of English, or several meaning potentials, but always in networks. So we can put this together, and it falls out of systemic functional way of thinking about it, say this is actually the semiotic order of things, right, where meaning is as a central property, but then is of course manifested socially, meaning is manifested in networks of people, meaners in different roles, taking on different roles, and that's in some sense where meanings are distributed, reside, exchange, and so on. So that's falls out of the sort of ordering of systems of different orders. And then, of course, we do get down to individual brains, but that's when we look at this in terms of the biological order of things. But brains are brains in bodies, and these bodies, these organisms, take on social roles in different role networks, and these take on different semiotic roles, communication roles in semiotic networks. So that's, I think, it's always been true, but is increasingly emphasized in sort of meaning making in our emerging new society, and the way that we can use tools to increase the networking capacity. People talk about the network world and so on. We can think about this. And part of thinking about this is, of course, precisely to the way we do, and I think it's very striking in the SFL community, that it is really very much a community of people collaborating. We're not into denouncing one another, competing with one another, very much collaborating in the different regions. And of course, we treasure the meanings of people who've created this. And I want to sort of just end to say Michael Halliday is still doing well, bit challenged biologically, but this is a cheerful picture from him in June this year. So I think in our network, all these are with us, even if they're not like Rukai, Jeff Thompson, Bill Greaves, for example, around biologically, but as meanings, they're still with us. So thank you for staying with me for this final part of Asphalt before the closure. Thank you.